Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the inaugural awarding of the Lux et Veritas Faculty Prize. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity at Yale. Our efforts over the years have created a robust space for students to engage in intellectually open and respectful dialogue and to hear all sides of issues. In addition to creating that space, the Buckley program wants to encourage and recognize others at Yale who help promote intellectual diversity on campus. With this goal in mind, we launched the Lux et Veritas Faculty Prize. This prize recognizes a Yale faculty member who actively fosters intellectual diversity for students and in the classroom. This faculty member exhibits the following qualities: goes above and beyond to promote intellectual engagement with different points of view and respectful discourse among students, creates a classroom environment where students feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and ideas openly, and cultivates the skill of genuine critical thinking in students. Last academic year, we asked students and alumni to nominate faculty members whom they thought best exemplified these qualities. After receiving nominations representing 21 faculty members from across the college and graduate schools, a rigorous judging panel found our winners' dedication to stimulating genuine critical thinking among its students and creating an environment of open dialogue in the classroom to be an above and beyond example of teaching excellence. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you the winner of our inaugural prize, Dr. Mordechai Levy-Eichel. Dr. Levy-Eichel is a member of the Department of Political Science and the Humanities program at Yale. He primarily works in the history and philosophy of learning and education and has written and worked on early modern history, the history of science, technology, and mathematics, Jewish history, the history of economic thought, naval history, and intellectual history. As demonstrated by the many comments from students who nominated him, Dr. Levy-Eichel has won the admiration of his students for the open and thought-provoking intellectual environment he creates in his classes. I myself have also witnessed this firsthand as a student in one of his courses. One student remarked, "I remember thinking to myself that these are exactly the sorts of courses and challenges I was hoping to find when I came to Yale." The discussions in his courses were vibrant and open, yet challenging in a manner that promoted growth. Another student said, "I can thank him for inculcating within me a desire to constantly examine and re-examine my priors, to truly engage in a ruthless critique of everything. More so, he not only inspired me to continue learning even after graduating from college, but also taught me how to critique the world while at the same time maintaining a deep sense of humility about how little I truly know. I can honestly say that he truly made my undergraduate education worth it." The Buckley program is proud to celebrate and promote such excellence. It is through allowing diverse points of view to be taken seriously, engaging in disagreements and discussions in good faith, and inculcating a spirit of intellectual humility that the true mission of the university is realized. Dr. Levy-Eichel exemplifies these ideals and puts them into practice in his classroom. The Buckley program is delighted to award the inaugural Lux et Veritas Faculty Prize to Dr. Mordechai Levy-Eichel.
Thank you.
Yeah, you should stand up and all right, I think we're all set. And then you can go to-
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
If I believed in grades, Ryan would definitely be getting an A for that. Thank you all for coming here. And since I don't imagine I will ever get another chance to do the Academy Award thing and thank everybody, I'm going to milk it for a few minutes. I'd like to especially thank Lauren for hosting this, for creating and helping establish the Buckley program as well, given my own politics, I never thought I would be receiving an award from such an organization. But I will also say that having grown up as a New York Jew, I frequently came upon not only copies of the National Review, but Firing Line. And in the spirit of creating not just discourse, which is an overused word, but argument, direct argument, a friendly direct argument, and real direct argument, William F. Buckley stands out, and I am in that way very deeply honored to be given an award for, in some small way, doing that. Any number of my friends are here, and I am delighted and honored that they came, and many of my students are here, which it'd be very uncool to say this in class, but seriously, I love you guys, and I'm more than honored that you've come. And my wife is here, and so the spotlight's not only on me. I can only inadequately thank her for all the times she has taken care of things so that I can teach, can prepare, can do my best to prepare, but not quite, and then bear the brunt of my frustration at not preparing as much as I'd like, and doing all that in such a way that I am lucky enough to be honored here. There's a prayer at the beginning of the Friday night Shabbat service dinner that's called Eshet Chayil, which is roughly translated as, woman of valor. And I don't usually sing it because it embarrasses her and because I can't sing. But she's more than earned that, not only as valor, but she's also much wiser than I am. Speaking of which, she offered rightly some advice as I was telling her some of what I would say. And she said, well, you might want to prepare your audience as you begin to give your lecture. And my first reaction, as usual, was, no, that's a horrible idea. That takes the energy, the fun, the pungency, the surprise out of it. Like I said, she's smarter than I am. I don't want the audience to be ready for it. Now, of course, you're all wondering, therefore, if I'm going to say something controversial. There's, of course, the chance that I'm, in fact, hyping this up because, in fact, I'm going to be quite boring. So I'm going to start, to some degree, as abstractly as possible. I'm speaking here as somebody with a PhD in philosophy. Technically, I have a PhD in history from Yale's own history department, but all PhDs are, by definition, doctors of philosophy, which I never like to stop reminding my students of that, given the abstract way we are trained in the echelons of the higher academy. So I'm going to start with some sort of philosophical and abstract analysis on a sort of general plane, before talking about what I see as some of the problems of teaching today, in particular, some of the things that go wrong in college teaching today. And I'm going to speak in particular about how I believe that politics, or the culture wars, or wokeness, or whatever you want to call it, I'm now old enough that when I was growing up, we called it PC, how that in fact is not the cause of most of the problems we bewail. In particular, I think that we professors are, to a larger degree than many of us would like to admit, especially those of us who are tenured, and I will add now and probably add later, I am not tenured, nor tenured track, but that we are, to a larger degree than most of us would like to acknowledge, responsible for these issues. And that's some of what I will hope to say, especially at the end, is how we could even go about changing that. Because despite how much I love to complain, and not only my wife knows that to be the case, I think in many ways we can, no matter what our position, whether we are not only tenured or administrators or whatever, have more of an ability to do that than most of us would recognize. I have a lot of power, or in the argot of today, the privilege, by simply virtue of teaching at an elite institution. But in many ways, the chief power that I have, or that most of us have in this regard, is quite directly the power of speech. And it was the power of speech that made what we usually call the first democracy, ancient Athens, into the cultural, political, intellectual, military, imperial power, and, for us, legacy. It was precisely because they had a politics based, we would say, the discourse, but I think it'd be unfair to use that term, rather the arguments they would have and they made room for as at the center of directing politics are inevitably, thankfully, still what drives a lot of our political thinking. They're not the only causes. If I'm going to be extra academic about it, I could list half a dozen others. There are plenty of qualifications one could and should make. There's questions of structure, economy, or whatever. In sum, though, there is most importantly in any liberal, democratic society a pride of place put on argument, on discourse, on language, and on intellectual, linguistic, personal confrontation. And that's a good thing. And the institutionalization of it legally, but not only legally, but culturally in America, by virtue of the First Amendment, but by virtue of a culture of free expression, do make America in that regard, I think, exceptional, to use the very old, but still, I think, true word in that regard. So, if you're still with me, let's do some philosophy. Diversity is not a good. Let me repeat that controversial statement. Diversity is not a good. Rather, it is a raw, irreducible fact of our lives and experiences. The variety, the diversity, the multiplicity, the incongruity, the contradictory nature, the plurality of our known world, of the world we experience, never mind the unknown world, is one of the greatest, in my opinion, facts and blessings of the world. Now, I like to get sermonic sometimes, so bear with me, especially as we are in the middle of what, for Jews is the high holiday season, the Chagim. So I'm going to sit with this very value-laden statement for a moment. Diversity or pluralism is the natural shape of the world as we know it and as we experience it. Now, one of the problems with higher ed is not, per se, the diversity issue or the poor way it is often handled, however you think it is done poorly, whether you think it is fostered enough or not fostered enough. The problem is the reverse. The problem is rather the question of unity, exclusivity, uniformity, and standardization. Diversity isn't an abstract good. Diversity, again, is a raw fact of our social and intellectual lives. It's as true as the fact that I'm just standing here talking to you, which for those who are philosophy majors may remember, that was about the sum total of G.E. Moore's famous proof of the existence of an outside world. But let me quote somebody who I think better describes our reality in that regard, and that is my favorite poet, the great American bard, Walt Whitman, who, in one of his many quotable lines, quote, "I resist anything better than my own diversity." Now, the problem really is that we have a search very often, personally and institutionally, for a one, an absolute, a uniform, a singular, some sort of simplistic and clear creed, if you will, answer, solution that promises to answer and solve all the issues we're bringing up. Whether there's a kind of racial uniformity, ideological uniformity, social uniformity, who knows? All have been tried. And in fact, even just putting it like that should hopefully bring and remind you of some of the most scary attempts to even implement such uniformity, namely the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And of course, even just the term totalitarian is itself an example of trying to have sort of one singular thing. And although he did not come up with the term, Benito Mussolini, proudly took on the term totalitarian to mean that all within the state, none outside the state, none against the state, exemplifying as much as anything the usual question of how to have everything be singular. He took credit for that because he liked the phrase totalitarian, but in fact it was coined by an opposition journalist. So let me put my cards even more squarely on the table. Visions of a certain kind of purity or singularity or oneness or uniformity or unity are an intellectual fetish. Speaking of such a desire for a single truth with deep empathy, the philosopher William James noted how widespread and mainstream the desire for some kind of singular answer was. He quoted the notable gentleman Nicholas Murray Butler, a famous philosopher in the early 20th century, who claimed, "Philosophy is humanity's hold on totality." Now, James noted there is no doubt that most of us would find the bare notion of some absolute singular oneness or answer to things inspiring. But in his notable collection of essays, A Pluralistic Universe, James comes out as critically as he could, quoting, "Every end, reason, motive, object of desire or aversion, every ground of sorrow or joy that we feel," and James, who was frequently depressed, but frequently started new ventures all the time, in fact, experienced those sorrows and joys with an especial keenness. All of those, he's saying, occur, quote, "in a world of finite multifariousness. For only in the world does anything really happen. There do events come to pass." Now, lest any of you think I'm drawing too close a connection between a certain kind of homogeneity or singularity on an intellectual level and the invocation of Mussolini or totalitarianism, let me note that Butler, who some of you may know for having been the longest-serving president of Columbia University, but also the Nobel Prize winner for helping found the Kellogg-Briand Pact to outlaw war, was, importantly, a supporter of Mussolini. He was one of the first people to institute anti-Jewish quotas in the Ivy League, and he was, for most of his tenure as president of Columbia, a fairly open anti-Semite. Ironically, and this is the most interesting part, because people are complex, if not contradictory themselves, if any of you have come upon his name recently, it's because he was notable for actually having Lionel Trilling, the first Jewish professor tenured at Columbia, tenured at an Ivy League English department, hired in the first place. I don't want to say that's an excuse for his actions, but I want to note just how internally pluralistic many figures are. Which again brings me to the main point I'm trying to make with this very philosophical prompt. The way many of our institutions act, Yale, but also all the institutions of higher education we are in some way or other connected to, is precisely to exclude, is precisely to filter out. We are proud, often, of the fact that Yale has a what? 5% admissions rate. The world is naturally an extremely diverse place. And yet, what most of the actions of most of these elite institutions do is, in fact, not embrace that by their very nature, but rather work in some way or other to standardize, to filter, and to go away from that natural multifariousness. Now, I'm not going to dilate too long on the benefits or defects of diversity, but I do want to note what my favorite example of it is, which comes from a book by a professor here at Yale, who writes about the attempts to institute scientific forestry in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here you had a normal forest, which, if this were in color, if it were a bigger shot, you'd get more of a sense of just how it looks like what? Something out of a horror movie. It looks like a natural forest in dark. In an attempt to make the natural forest more economical and also more scenic, the best, easiest to grow, quickest to arrange poplar tree was taken out, and in fact, most of the trees were cut down. This is in Tuscany, and they were then lined up so that people could take walks easily through the forest. The problem with doing this, of course, as Scott notes in his book, is that the second a certain disease came around that was affecting the poplar trees, in particular them, the forest was decimated. So despite how much less elegant and difficult to work with, despite the fact that it wasn't economical or aesthetically pleasing for the best minds out there, it turned out that this was a much more robust, healthy, and flexible sort of ecosystem. I note all this really because I am proud and lucky to be awarded this prize for fostering intellectual diversity. I am more proud than I feel like I should admit, and regularly have been, trying not to get too big ahead, unsuccessfully. But in many ways, I didn't earn it. The diversity is already there among the students. I just happen to be good at drawing it out. It's already there. And in so many of our discussions of how to foster it or grow it or have it, the balance of our thinking or efforts should just as often be on the problems of how we foster problematically a certain kind of unity or standardization that all of you who have recently applied to college know just how much you have to work on as you fill in certain boxes to hit certain notes to appeal to certain people in just the right way. And as somebody who has multiple times been on the job market, there are things more annoying, but there are few things more annoying than trying to fill out job applications and trying to put many complex, diverse, interesting, hopefully, experiences into some annoying form that nobody wants to read in the first place. Okay, that's a lot of philosophy, and it's a lot of high dungeon, so I'm going to end on a funny and personal note before we actually get to the substance of this. I can speak about the problems with Yale's application or applications because, as some of you know, when I applied to Yale as an undergrad, I was rejected, sort of. My application was sent back because I had been homeschooled, and I had decided not to take the SATs, and I had a, therefore, very weird application, and Yale, to its credit, sent it back to me with the check uncashed, unlike some of the other schools which just rejected me outright. But I'm somehow teaching here now, and I don't say that because I feel like saying, yay, I got in Yale, but rather to just note the irony of the admissions procedures working in this way. There is something problematic, however much we think of the importance of standardizing things when we move it to a mass level, of not trying to take into account a certain natural plurality in the first place. And I very happily went to the University of Chicago. So, okay. My main contention tonight is that the culture wars are a smokescreen and an excuse for an enormous amount of poor and boring education today. Now, usually during the rest of the school year, of course, somebody has some incident that becomes written up, that becomes promoted and then goes viral about all the different ways in which certain kinds of cancel culture or wokeness or what have you have dominate our intellectual atmosphere. It takes the spirit and the life out of classroom discussion, never mind campus discussion. And I don't want to ignore the way those things have happened or the experiences that people have had with that on both sides of the spectrum. There are obvious and true examples of those things happening. And yet, the deeper reasons for the stifling experience, in particular, so common on campuses today, really has to do with the way, again, we've cultivated, especially at many of our most elite colleges and universities, a timidity, an intellectual and moral narrowness, and an obsession with a very limited sense of professionalism that is symptomatic of our larger cultural and social issues, if not our larger cultural and social decay. But, complaining about decay is in today, so I don't want to do too much of that. Now, just in case what you think I've stated is wrong, or misguided, or just a self-serving series of talking points, please ask yourself first if the divisive issues warping our educational institutions today, be it race, be it pronouns, be it the adjunct crisis, be it the overproduction of PhDs, let's say they were to suddenly, poof, disappear. Do we really think that vigorous intellectual argument and discussion would suddenly be the norm? Do we really think discussion would flow in new and different ways? Do we really think that everybody was sharing novel opinions that they were inhibited from talking about before? Maybe. I'd like to think so. But I think realistically, little would actually change because the underlying forces behind our difficulties in discussing, yes, I forgot to put the title one up earlier. The underlying forces, in fact, structuring our or limiting our intellectual discourse don't descend from these more contingent and current bugaboos. Our elite schools, like Yale, which welcome larger and larger shares of first-generation low-income students, nevertheless still serve as finishing schools for the wealthy and the well-connected, what we used to call the aristocracy, which is an older term that I think, unfortunately, better captures the prestige too often accorded to those in power, as well as the sham of the idea of aristocracy in the first place. Today's aristocracy, of course, includes liberals and conservatives, as well as self-styled radicals, not to mention reactionaries. And aristocrats, despite their claims to the contrary, are often a very, very delicate class. They are inbred, literally. And if anybody doesn't believe me, please go have fun looking into the bloodlines of early modern Europe, or just go look at some of Velázquez's paintings. Aristocrats are jealous of their rank and privileges, especially because such status is inherited and unearned, like legacy admission. And they are uninterested and unused to interacting with others, especially those without a similar Tony background. And the teachers and administrators running our schools, who are, of course, often the products of this system, have therefore, again, not simply gotten in the way of fostering pluralism, but often subtly and actively discourage it, cultivating a diversity that is only skin deep. Too many of our leading institutions fear difference, disagreement, dissent, independence, and conflict, especially our leading institutions. Argument, that's scary. And part of the reason is that we professors, on the whole, don't actually ourselves practice respectful, friendly, yet severe confrontation. And nor do I mean Twitter snark, which is hardly respectful, nor friendly, nor even really any kind of actual confrontation. Like pornography, Twitter can be stimulating and very popular, but it's not sex. we do not model, that is, we professors do not model serious, sharp, warm argument for the students too often. We teach them to fear confrontation when we should do the opposite. We should burn our students. Now, I mean this metaphorically, of course. But the mere fact that I should add such a clarification is in many ways an example of how tepid and shallow, how thin and unimaginative our discussions of teaching are in the first place. College is in many ways one giant safe space to intellectually experiment, to play with the fire of ideas. Students like to be aflame. In the words of T.S. Eliot, perhaps my favorite anti-Semitic poet, should aim for a lifetime burning in every moment. Okay, then. So, besides the obvious, how do you light students on fire? Since unfortunately there are people who think I have advice to give, despite the fact that I often don't quite know why I'm doing what I'm doing, I've tried to distill some ideas or commandments. We will go through them one at a time as I do a little exegesis on them. And in case any of you think I'm being a little too radical, I've brought the original. So, there is a God, but make for yourself many, many idols. So I could say some vague generalities about this, and I probably will because it's the vaguest one, just as the question of I am the Lord your God means what besides, well, people spend lifetimes figuring that out. I will start with a series of anecdotes and return to this one repeatedly. When I was a graduate student in my first year, I had weekly meetings with my advisor because I wasn't quite doing as much as I should, in his view. He was a workaholic. And we had weekly meetings, and so I was, of course, trying to come up with questions for the weekly meetings. And I remember one time I asked a question, and he said, no, that's a philosophical question. That's not a historical one. That's not a good question. And it stuck with me because I didn't see why that would make it a bad question. Despite the fact that I was in a history department, there's really no actual dividing line between the two. There are many dividing lines between the two, and those lines are often fairly frequently crossed. There are many examples of those lines having certain divisions, and it depends on what you mean by philosophy or history. And there's certainly historians who are read by any number of philosophers, and any number of philosophers who are read by any number of historians. And of course, most of the people we actually think of as philosophers in the first place, whom we assign in any great books course, or that we think of as part of forming the canon of philosophy, never themselves had PhDs, which is what makes officially a philosopher today. The dividing line was arbitrary. And it's unfortunately symptomatic of just how disciplines in major universities work and work to perpetuate themselves. Here's a second anecdote. Somebody in my department, a colleague, was recently teaching a course last year on American politics. And we were talking about teaching, and he's an excellent teacher, and he was telling me about one of his most fun teaching experiences. Of course, fun is a word we don't use as much with regard to teaching, because so often, especially at places like this, one is not hired for one's teaching. If people were hired for their teaching, then the professors would actually, who were doing the hiring, might even go and visit those people whom they're thinking of hiring to those universities to see how they're actually teaching their element instead of just presenting a faux teaching lesson that's an example of a job talk. So, one of his most fun experiences when he was teaching a course on American politics, and he was talking about how he was teaching drug policy. And he had clearly been having fun that day, and so he decided, in fact, to take, ironically, the very quote-unquote reactionary position. Our drug policy has not only been right, it hasn't been strong enough. We have to work on prohibition. These are the problems of drugs. The usual litany that one would imagine from a sort of stereotype of some drug czar warrior. He clearly had a lot of fun, and of course the students themselves had to, for the first time, think about, wait, how do I justify my liberal position on drugs? Why do I think certain drugs should be legalized? Why is it okay if I see drugs all around me? And he told me this story because, in particular, at the end of class, one of the parents came up to him and said, I just want to thank you for that class. I'd been worried I was sending my son to a den of iniquity, and in fact, seeing you teach some good moral virtues, that was reassuring. Third anecdote. Most recently, I played Socrates. Usually, I like to indulge in certain types of Socratic questioning in my seminars, but we were reading the Republic in my directed studies class, and for a variety of reasons, one of them being, again, we just had the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, and the Republic begins with Socrates and friends leaving a festival. I started asking the students, as in one of the characters in the Republic, which is, of course, a dramatic dialogue, the questions that Socrates was posed and was asking himself. And it was a fun time, because I was trying to get the students not to go through and understand the Republic, but to be doing what happens in the Republic. I don't say this to pat myself on the back, but to note that I never had that experience when I took a class which read the Republic, because there was a sort of orthodoxy about how you should teach. You should read the text closely. You should not bring in any secondary sources. You should not have opinions as a professor about what the author is saying. You should not let the students get too wild. You should be sure to make them understand certain things before letting them criticize other things. And it led to a class where I found myself hating the Republic, with, I thought, even good reason. I go back and forth on my opinion of it today, but I'll save that for another time. The point of all of these stories is simply to note the variety of issues that one has with teaching that will not satisfy any sort of best practices put out by any official teaching institution. It would be weird for somebody to say, role play in this way. Maybe you'll find examples of it, but not at the most notable places. The point I'm trying to make is that it's fine to play with fire and do things in experimental ways. And it's fine to cross intellectual lines. It's fine to, if any of you like me grew up watching the Ghostbusters, it's fine to cross the streams. These are ideas. They are not proton packs. Not enough of you watch the Ghostbusters, apparently. Thou shalt talk about religion and politics. So despite the fact that this is a very waspy institution still, and one of course, the chief things to do is not talk about religion and politics because that involves argument, there's nothing more interesting. And in fact, all of our views about philosophy or economics or history are usually undergirded and interact with our views about religion and politics. And we labor too often under the assumption that having certain views expressed means you can't speak in a disinterested way. And that is, to be honest, bull. One can, one should, and anybody who thinks about it for long enough should be able to, though I realize many would still not be able to stop themselves, talk about their views on politics, their views on religion, and talk about texts or ideas in a disinterested manner. One can, hopefully, with a little practice, pat one's head and rub one's tummy. As we were just yesterday seeing if we could with our kids. And after a few seconds, the younger one got it. But part of the reason we don't do this is that we don't model it much. And again, that's not because of the intellectual homogeneity of too much of the faculty, but because we don't know how to have a certain type of comedy or community. One of the most notable and best encapsulations of this that I thought was from a summer I spent at a yeshiva. It was not a degree-granting yeshiva, so to speak. It did not ordain rabbis yet. And there were a few rabbinical students there, though. And as part of the introduction, the question was asked, well, why are you coming here to study? And I still remember one of the things that one of them said, which was one of the rabbinical students said, who was, in fact, in rabbinical school, 20 blocks away from the yeshiva I was at. And that was, well, I want to be at an institution where my teachers study together. I want to be at an institution where my teachers learn together. There isn't too often, we can get to why exactly some other time, but there too often is not a sense of actual community that would need to undergird the arguments that we can and should have. Now, this isn't to repeat the old adage of, oh, it's an atomistic world, et cetera, et cetera. No, these things aren't actually that hard to do, to host people for dinner, to have not only just coffee with people, but to respond to them by email, to call people up, God help us, not simply text them. These are things that precisely tenure is theoretically enabling people to do. But the structure of the university, by virtue of having certain emphasis on certain kinds of narrow professionalism and homogeneity, has made, unfortunately, less common among those whom it tenures and those whom it holds up as its ideal. Okay, I'm going to go slightly more quickly so I don't keep you too long. Cold call on students. This might be my favorite part. I don't know why I started doing it. I thought it just seemed right to do if nobody was giving an answer to a question. Mostly because, of course, I knew the students did have answers or thoughts. They were just actually afraid to speak them or say them. The same way people are sometimes afraid to start eating the food when nobody else has, despite the fact that the host has said, okay, people can start. And then somebody has to start. But who's it going to be? So, cold calling, it's refreshing. It works. It's fine. It's good. Students have things to say, and nobody's ever complained to me. And it fosters a more lively discussion. And we're just not used to doing it, and it's fine. Confront and push back on their ideas. I'm not quite sure how to say more about this without making it sound too invidious. So I'm going to try and say as little as possible and excuse myself ahead of time for whatever invidiousness there is. But I've had students in other classes tell me that there are discussions, but they're not as confrontational because students or professors won't push back. Why not? Well, they're afraid. Why are they afraid? Well, that's unclear. There are a variety of reasons, but there's no reason to be afraid. And in fact, it fosters a more lively discussion. And in fact, the greatest example we have of people academically and intellectually succeeding comes from the city college university environment of the early 20th century. I highly recommend, and some of you have been forced to watch the film, Arguing the World, about the New York intellectuals, where people like Irving Howe, who founded Dissent, Irving Kristol, who founded multiple magazines and was a lodestar for the conservatives and then the neoconservatives, and Daniel Bell, a notable sociologist, as well as Nathan Glazer, another notable sociologist, all got what they considered their most important education from arguing in Alcove 1 and Alcove 2 between the Stalinist communists and the anti-Stalinist communists. And it was good, and it was inspiring, and they learned economics from it, and they learned philosophy from it, and they learned history from it because it meant something to them, and they had no need to have a professor moderating it. They were arguing with themselves, and this wasn't debate because it wasn't stylized. This was them arguing about what they thought the most important issues of the day were. It's fine and good to argue in this way, and if one way to foster that is by cold calling or pushing back on people's ideas, if you can do that gently, decently, kindly, in a friendly, warm manner, the two are not contradictory, and in fact, it is healthy. You should bite the hand that feeds you or rebel against your father and your mother. Your father and your mother, hopefully, love you very much. And therefore, one of the best things you can have with them is an honest and serious discussion without having a worry that there will be breaks. Now, of course, for so many reasons, there will be irreparable breaks. And I'm riffing on this here because I want to have certain references to, of course, the classic Ten Commandments. But the real point is one should bite the hand that feeds one intellectually. To some degree, that's how progress is made. It has to be some sort of different, argumentative, not simply progress, but correction and disagreement in order to have some type of intellectual progress. And that often means realizing that those who have supported one or pushed one or helped one can be wrong because that's how you outgrow certain things. Draw on your personal experience. This is always one of the funny ones to me because it just seems natural and obvious. A lot of my life these days is taken up with trying to take care of my children, who are wonderful, easy kids comparatively, and yet at the same time, a handful, as all kids and children are. So of course, when I think about what the purpose of language is, or how to have certain political rules, or whatever else Plato's discussing in the Republic, examples like that come to mind. And yet, what? It's sort of weird, apparently, how much I sometimes bring up personal instances in my class. And how do I know this? Because when I was myself an undergraduate, there was almost none of that. We fostered a faculty, unfortunately, that is unused to talking about themselves. This is weird. This is really weird. Our personal experiences are some of the most determinative things for how we think, how we act, and yet we're unused to sharing or talking about them. It's unhealthy. To some degree, there's a corollary of that. It's infectious to speak about one's likes and dislikes, and it's not intellectually wrong to do that. It's really good to talk about, not simply in an official way, what translation of Plato is better or not, or why you don't like certain translations, or why you have a snarky opinion of certain views. That doesn't stop one or need to stop one from actually at the same time considering that in a disinterested, critical way. And if it does seem like that, then you really have a problematic, which is an overused word, but here appropriate, problematic professor. And they're probably a bad teacher. And again, we don't really screen for teaching. Not seriously, or at least not as seriously as we do for research. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we want to continue that way. Maybe it would be bad to even screen for teaching in such a professionalized way. But let's not pretend that we do serious work in thinking about it, when in fact we often don't. It's good to actually be personal and express one's preferences, likes, and dislikes. God forbid it humanizes one. Should I do some exegesis on this one or not? Obviously, again, I don't mean it literally. I mean, I do when it comes to ideas. But part of my point here is that it's fine to do this and healthy to do this when it comes to ideas, because in fact, the history of politics or political ideas or economics or math is in fact a remix. Culture is a remix in a very deep way. Musically, there are repeated melodies and riffs. And mathematically, these things come and go, and they infect, they amalgamate, they spur, they fertilize one's ideas. And one gets those ideas by hook or by crook, and most often, even by reading outside what one is assigned to or thinks is necessary to. One does that precisely by playing intellectual hooky. And we don't foster that. We don't encourage it. In fact, we think of training as precisely moderating that, if not excluding it. And there is a virtue to training, and there's a virtue to focus. And I'm not saying there isn't. I'm presenting here the contrary case, because precisely at places like this, there's an overemphasis, and Yale is a leading institution in the world and helps set an example, despite how much we turn our shoulder and look to what Harvard or Stanford these days is doing. We can set an example of doing a whole lot less of trying to standardize and formalize and uniform in bad ways too many sorts of ideas. We can embrace and spur on the plurality or the diversity that we often claim we want to foster by not trying to pare it down intellectually, never mind in other ways in the first place. Experimentation and failure are good, and not just for your soul. So, obviously, one could give a whole lecture on the question of experimentation or failure. I will just say one part about it, which is, again, part of the problem with our institutions today is that it is designed, we select people for their successes. They have and know more if they've had both failures and successes. And everybody's had failure and successes. You can't be human if you haven't. But we don't, of course, put that in our CV, or we don't present, or we don't lead with that, or we feel embarrassed by it, and that's fair. But we don't have a culture in which it's, of course, recognized just how helpful it would be, mental health-wise, psychologically, and otherwise, for certain types of experimentation, and therefore certain types of inevitable failure, to, in fact, be precisely what makes for better scholars, teachers, researchers, human beings in the first place. There are better ways to design any type of application than already listing what type of grants you get. And there are any number of studies that in fact show that the most important grant you can get if you are a researcher is not one of the big grants, is not some well-known grant, is not getting many grants. It's getting a single grant in the first place, which then has a knock-on effect of getting more grants because people want to give success to those who've been successful. If you want to do something new, it is precisely, in fact, being wary of that. So on the theme of failure, as we wind up, you shall covet as an attempt to, in fact, exemplify number 9. One One of the funny things is how hard it is for students who are, of course, in an ultra-competitive environment after having spent so many of their lives being competitive in order to get into a place like this. The professors are as well. And so it's weird to talk about one's deficiencies. But if one doesn't do it, who will? So one of the funniest things to me is, of course, the fact that even after winning this prize, I can admit, to just show how petty I can be, when I hear about teachers whom students I have love, other than me, I also get jealous. Really? That's insane, right? It's stupid, right? It's petty, right? Yes, yes it is. And that's fine, and that's normal, and that's natural, and I promise you I'm working on it. But more importantly, I'm actually delighted when students tell me how much they love their other professors. Seriously. But I want to note how natural a certain not only covetousness is, but how rare it is to speak personally and honestly, and that one can and should, and that it's good. I haven't been canceled yet, though apparently since this will be recorded, who knows, I may be. And you know what? That's a risk worth taking. When I was in college, I still sometimes do, sometimes wear my kippah, sometimes don't. But whenever I would wear my kippah, I would often get the question, oh, do you want to be a rabbi? Which I always found surprising, and no, I did not. But one reason I did not was that I thought I don't want to be a sort of model. The problem is, as a professor, which somehow I've become, I am inevitably a model. Anybody standing at the front of a classroom is. Now, in probably the most famous speech on teaching as a vocation, or scholarship as a vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf, by Max Weber, he draws one of the most famous and most wrong, as far as I'm concerned, ideas about teaching and scholarship that has been widely, of course, presented and discussed by, of course, the professors. He draws a false distinction, bedazzlingly. I always wanted to say Weber and bedazzling. He draws a false distinction between the scholar and the subject. But inevitably, if you are learning and presenting certain subjects to others and have enormous power in your example, you do get, not conflated, but related to it. And so one does have a certain power and authority, and the scholarship and the subject, the scholarship and the teacher, or the teaching and the teacher are not simply separate, despite the fact that that is a mantra of so many professors. And so that to the degree that we should therefore think not only about what we teach, but also think about how we can be cognizant of those ways we do it so that, in fact, the students come to feel not only comfortable, but in fact, welcome to exceed and grow. To the degree that we can foster that, that's one of the most important things. We need to be, to the degree that we can, and to the degree that if you take away anything from this lecture, it is as strong a stand as possible against a sort of timidity and preciousness. It is an attempt to realize what power one has by virtue of standing in front of others, by virtue of talking, and by virtue of, in that way, whether or not one has any official administrative power, of leading nevertheless. And to some degree, hopefully doing that with a certain humor, because we are overly earnest. I do that all the time. But education is boring if it's not also fun. And part of the reason to have so much high learning is because it enriches one's life. And one's life is pretty empty if one feels like one is in a straitjacket. And that is often the case when it's simply high level this, high level that. But if one can play and embrace the Dionysian as well as the Polynean, no matter what Plato counsels against that, then one is robbing oneself. So let me end, not with any of those Greeks or any bad attempts at humor. This is my brother-in-law, the mathematician who is really the humorist in the family. But again, with one of our great American writers. And as far as I'm concerned, the best political essay of the 19th century, though it is not often thought that, because of course he's a poet, Walt Whitman, in his essay Democratic Vistas, claimed that the greatest lessons of nature through the universe are perhaps the lessons of variety and freedom. Lessons that America's grand experiment in collective self-governance embodies, at least when we're at our best. We're not often at our best. But teachers and professors, we need to model and embody the variety and the contradictions, the pluralism and the iconoclasm, and the independence that America was founded upon, both inside and outside our classrooms, because willy-nilly we're modeling it anyway, so best to do it as best as possible, so that we can be and we can foster, hopefully, in these tempestuous times, our own laboratories of democracy. Thank you.
There is now a reception to follow, so thank you all for being with us this afternoon.
I am happy to not only meet any of you, have question and answers there, or if anybody has any burning desires. Should we take 5 or 10 minutes, or should we do that at a reception? Sure. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk.
You're welcome.
I'm in agreement with a lot of the things you said. And one area that I think is
By the way,
often,
what's your name? Because my
Oh.
eyesight, I can't quite see what's on your label.
Oh, my name is Kevin Chow.
Hi, Kang Cha.
One area that we don't often talk about in the classroom is questions of identity.
Yes.
What approach would you advise for students who seek to question that topic,
Can you say more about what you mean by identity?
such as your social beliefs on gender transition, sensitive issues such as same-sex relationships, and things that people often speak about in reference to your sixth commandment from personal experience? Do you have any general advice for how to approach these topics, both as an educator and as a conversant in the discussion as a student?
I mean, this is when I, to some degree, reveal my pragmatist side of it's all local and contextual. There are larger guidelines I could give of be respectful, be friendly, both feel free to listen to the others and state what you think, make time for the person. But that's all vague, and hopefully anybody would do that in the first place, though I realize many won't. If somebody is feeling brave enough to talk about personal issues or identity issues, I would simply hope that professors make time to talk with them if they want to be spoken to. If they're that personal, I'm not sure they're best thought of as political, ideological conflicts in such a classroom there. I'm not saying there aren't times and places when that couldn't be the case, and I'm not saying there aren't places for discussion and argument, But on a general level, I couldn't hope to offer general ways to behave other than be friendly, be polite, be honest. If somebody is talking about such things, it is hard. And the best thing to do is find some time to talk to somebody if they have sought you out. It's hard for anybody to talk about these things, even with one's closest friends. And so if somebody thinks they want to talk about it with you, that's great. And think about what the best forum and place and way to do that is. And classrooms are sometimes good places and sometimes not. Oh, there's. I saw somebody.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. I'm losing my voice a little bit. My name is Louisa Lombard, and I teach in anthropology here. Thank you so much for this talk. It seems to me, one thing that I've observed is that somewhere along the way, being naive came to be the greatest sin. Whether you're a professor or a student, you don't want to look naive. You don't want to say something that would make you seem naive in some way. I don't know exactly how and why that happened, but it seems to me like that's a big problem because it makes everybody really nervous about trying out ideas, about being curious, about expressing joy, or noticing that there's something good in the world or something along those lines. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this and whether you see any ways to perhaps bring naivete back in as, at least to a certain degree, a kind of virtue.
That question was so appropriate. The check is in the mail, Louisa. So, given how I do things, I was still playing around with the Ten Commandments, which I guess somebody in such a lordly position shouldn't say. I don't think God was fiddling around with them right before Moses came up the mountain. As I said, my wife, who's wiser than me, knows. In an earlier version of this, or rather, in a tweak I didn't have the time to add, but something one of my students told me about almost exactly that point, and that he noted about my classroom was that I take a special time if somebody mentions some name or some event to stop for a moment and explain what that is. So if you're mentioning this novel I read by Jonathan Franzen, this poem by this person, or the 7 Years' War, or the 30 Years' War, or the Peloponnesian War, I take a moment and I step back and I say either something like, does everybody know what this is? Students sometimes say, I don't know what that is, and take the opening, but even more often, nobody raises their hand. Usually then, especially if they're not answering, then not everybody knows, and they're really embarrassed to. So I take a moment and I step back and I explain what the 30 Years' War is, and it's generally thought of as, this large Protestant Catholic conflict in the early part of the 17th century that helped set up the modern international nation-state system by virtue of how it was settled. And hopefully put everybody sort of on the same basis, because there's an enormous amount, as you note, fear or inability, or it's hard for people to be naive and friendly, be infectious with their enthusiasm, especially among professors, but also just as much among students who are new and are measuring themselves and are full of worries about how to impress not only their professors, but their classmates. And the only thing I can offer in this regard is when one has the power and the opportunity, because it presents itself often in class, to make things as clear and simple as possible, one should take that opportunity. And that was, in fact, one of the things I wanted to note as one of the commandments. And then I didn't have the time to change it. And then I thought, admit mistakes. Okay, I'll put it under that one. And then given that time was running out and I forgot, I didn't have time to do it then. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to note that, in fact, I think regularly we have the time to make it clear that however much jargon or names or events or references that people may assume others have, they don't. And in fact, to the degree that you can make it clear what they are, and to make it clear that not everybody knows everything, and even better, that everybody has something more to learn and it's fun too, then, you know, to use a cliche, then we're doing the Lord's work. Right. On that note, I can see there are people gathering, so I will